Today I'll be giving a talk about conservational theory and practice as represented in Amitav Ghosh's novel The Hungry Tide. There will be a works cited page at the very end of my talk for those of you who are curious about which scholars and thinkers I'm drawing on to make my arguments. Scientists and fishermen towards a hybrid conservational praxis in Amitav Ghosh's The Hungry Tide. In his polemical third world critique of deep ecology, Ramachandra Guha scrutinizes the implications of transplanting an ecological ethic and approach to conservation from North America to the global South. This iteration is one in a long history of transplanting ideas about environmental management from North to South that dates back to the British Raj in India. It is a genealogy of mixed origins, born of an approach to environmental conservation that marries the approaches of the successive acts of enclosure in England with the approaches to conservation that evolved through the stark deforestation that accompanied early colonial enterprises in St. Helena and the West Indies. The top-down implementation of a conservational praxis that annexed large swaths of territory, making, quote, the Forest Department India's biggest landlord, with more than a fifth of the country's land in its possession, evolved from a traveling theory of conservation, to borrow from Edward Said's term, modified by the various contexts it had canvassed prior to arriving in India. The cast of a North-South transplantation of environmental policy is therefore less a marker of the places in which these ideas of conservation evolve than it is an indication of the asymmetries of power that are underwritten and enhanced by their applications. Asymmetries that across various contexts, but most recently in the global South, achieve a pristine, protected, natural space by dispossessing poor communities. Amitav Ghosh's The Hungry Tide dramatizes these histories of dispossession in the Sundarbans through three focal points: the settlement of protected islands, the killing of the endangered Bengal tiger, and through the etiology of the tiger's predilection for human flesh. These cases present a series of confrontations between colonial arrogance and an animate nature, between draconian government conservation policy and the pressing needs of poor people striving to build new communities, and finally between a scientist's impulse to protect an endangered species and a fisherman's implication in a tiger's death by mob justice. The confrontations and questions rehash some of the debates between biocentrism and anthropocentrism. With regards to the environment, while introducing a third factor, the visibility of those humans upon whom the costs of conservation tend to fall. Conservation, its sordid origins notwithstanding, is indeed an urgent matter, and by the novel's end, we encounter the beginnings of a conservational praxis that is community-based and finds a third collaborative path between a character's scientific expertise and that of the fishermen who intimately know the waters of the tide country. Lucibari, the island around which much of the novel's plot revolves, is a relatively recent settlement that dates back to the early 20th century. Scottish capitalist Sir Daniel Hamilton purchased 10,000 acres of the tide country with the intent of building a utopian community for the poor and dispossessed on these newly reclaimed islands. Lucibari, which falls into disrepair after Sir Daniel dies in 1939, functions as the precedent for the Moorish Japi settlers in the 1970s, who also settled previously uninhabited lands and begin to build an organized, seemingly utopian society for the poor and dispossessed. The differences between these two settlement projects separated by some 70 years are instructive. Sir Daniel's top-down project is succeeded by a settlement push from below. And whereas Sir Daniel claims unprotected, uninhabited land in a climate of colonial expansion, the Moorish Japi community settles on land that is expressly administered by the Indian government's forestry department. This charged detail is what leads to Daniel Hamilton being hailed as a visionary, and also results in the starvation, murder, and subsequent expulsion of the surviving Moorish Japi settlers by government-hired thugs. That the Moorish Japi settlers are expelled from the land because it belongs to the Forest Department creates a through line between their dispossession and the colonial policy that placed such large tracts of land under the government's custodianship. Indeed, it is on this basis that the settlers' claims to the community they have built are rendered illegitimate, and those who refuse to help them, like Nilima and the Calcutta intellectuals, as well as those like Nirmal, who do try to help, are aware of the contours of the situation. So much so that when readers first learn of these settlers through the writings in Nirmal's notebook, this is paired with an awareness of the settlement's precarity. Quote, I heard for the first time of the events unfolding at Maurice Jappi. The islands were close by, and in the school I was visiting, there were many teachers who had witnessed the progress of the exodus. They had seen tens of thousands of settlers making their way to the island in boats, dinghies, and boat-boaties. Many of their own people had gone off to join the movement, drawn by the prospect of free land. But even as they marveled at the refugees' boldness, there were those who predicted trouble. The island belonged to the forest department, and the government would not allow the squatters to remain. The subsequent expulsion turns violent not because the settlers have taken up arms, but because the government treats them as a roving species to be culled. A stance that is made especially ironic by the fervent protections in place for the Bengal tiger. In fact, the same conservationist project that declares islands like Maurice Jappi uninhabitable in the service of forest preservation extends into considerable protections for the tiger. Protections that are in fact an instance of art imitating life, finding a real-life counterpart in Project Tiger, a conservation effort that Ramachandra Guha describes as, quote, a network of parks hailed by the international community as an outstanding success that puts the interests of the tiger and those of poor peasants living in and around the reserve. The designation of tiger reserves was made possible only by the physical displacement of existing villages and their inhabitants. Their management requires the continuing exclusion of peasants and livestock. End quote. As stakeholders in the nation, and as people who have a potentially helpful place in the tide country's ecosystem, the poor, represented by characters like Kusum, Horin, and Fokir, are doubly discounted by the powers that be they arms of the colonial or the post-colonial state. The confrontation between human beings and tigers in the Hungry Tide comes to a head when Pia, Fokir, and Kanai encounter a standoff between a mob of villagers and a tiger trapped in a cattle pen. When Pia tries to stop the mob from killing the tiger and finds that Fokir has joined them, the cultural and experiential chasm between them is thrown into stark relief. Before this moment, they have enjoyed an undeniable connection despite their inability to communicate in the same language. Now that they are on fiercely opposed sides to the matter, it becomes clear to Pia that they do not understand each other. What she sees is a group of incensed people ready to exact revenge on an animal. What the villagers see, as they surround the cattle pen in anticipation of killing the tiger, is a means to administer justice to an oppressive presence. The tiger has not only been caught stealing costly, painstakingly raised livestock, its species also has a history of terrorizing the inhabitants of the tide country. Indeed, they are so terrified of this creature and its penchant for human flesh that its name alone sparks widespread terror. Pia's perspective is made possible by a degree of detachment from the lived realities of the peasants. Indeed, even Kanai, who eventually chastises her for her actions, embarks on their journey unaware of the staggering rates at which tigers kill humans in the tide country, at a rate of at least 2 persons a week in the Indian portion of the Sundarbans alone. Here, too, the novel's characters directly point to the forest department, whose attempts to address the tide country tiger's unusual appetite for human flesh further highlight its lack of regard for the lives the tiger preys upon. The list of solutions the department comes up with reads like a comedy of errors, running the gamut from digging for drinkable water for the tigers while the humans that they devour have none, to suggestions of using electroshock therapy to sway tide country tigers away from the consumption of human flesh. Unsurprisingly, none of these methods work. The standoff between Pia and the villagers juxtaposes 2 seemingly incompatible urgencies. For the villagers who live under the persistent threat of death by tiger, they must either kill the tiger they have trapped or resign themselves to becoming its prey at a later date. For Pia, the killing of an endangered species pushes it towards extinction and enacts a worrying variant of anthropocentrism that she reads as harmful to the environment. While both the concerns of Pia and the villagers are urgent, that of the mob is evidently more immediate, as are the costs the villagers bear for a conservation policy that will punish them for self-defense. The fact remains that the policies surrounding tiger protection are enacted by people who are far removed from their reality and have likely never lived under the threat of death by tiger. In Kanai's critique of Pia's actions, he acknowledges as much, encouraging her to consider Foke and the villagers' perspective and her own complicity in an unequal system. Quote, "To be fair to Foke and Horan, I don't think it's quite that simple, Pia. I mean, aren't we a part of the horror as well? You and me and people like us. Because it was people like you who made a push to protect the wildlife here, without regard for the human costs. And I'm complicit because people like me, Indians of my class that is, have chosen to hide these costs, basically in order to curry favor with their Western patrons. It's not hard to ignore the people who are dying. After all, they are the poorest of the poor. But just ask yourself whether this would be allowed to happen anywhere else." Kanai's intervention pushes against the rationale that allocates some islands and the tigers as protected territory and wildlife without considering the perspectives and needs of the poor. To consider them legitimate stakeholders in questions of environmental management and conservation would open up a more equitable path towards sustainability. It is telling that Kanai, the Calcutta elite, a self-described international man of mystery, whose class contempt for Foke is bested only by his jealousy at the fact that Foke receives the romantic attention from Pia that he so craves, is the one who prompts her to consider the fisherman's perspective. His comment also points towards a geopolitical calculus that invariably discounts the villagers whose tiger killing Pia is so horrified by. If they are discounted, their interests unprotected, their needs unaccounted for, in economic and environmental policy, then their recourse to vigilante justice against a tiger presents as a desperate response in a circumstance where there are few other alternatives. To treat environmental conservation as an abstract good, as Pia does, is to disembody it, a result indicated by her inability to comprehend that the villagers she wishes to prevent from killing this tiger are responding to the persistent threat of death and bodily harm. Pia's perspective of a self-contained natural world, where the desires of humans are really beside the point, where the biosphere is primary and human mastery over nature ought to be checked, isn't exactly applicable in this situation. Indeed, one would be hard-pressed to read the desperation with which the villagers scream "Mar," expressing their intent to kill the trapped animal as evidence of human mastery over nature. Her invocation of, quote, "an invisible line that prevents us from deciding that no other species matters except ourselves," end quote, is ironic, if only because in this instance it is the tiger that has crossed an invisible line by venturing so squarely into human territory. Something that, as Foke explains, it would only do if it wanted to die. Foke's participation in the tiger killing and his deep knowledge of the river and the islands, one that is accompanied by an understanding of his survival as contingent upon the environment around him, are actually not mutually exclusive. A fisherman who catches crabs for a living, he is the reason Pia finds the dolphins she has traveled in search of, and the thoughtfulness of his crab catching, achieved by affixing broken bits of tile to a string that the crabs latch onto and refuse to release, is minimally invasive and a relatively humane fishing method. All of which is to say that his lack of formal education does not correspond to environmental ignorance. Indeed, the top-down policies that make decisions about his region without his input or consent appear to operate on the assumption that people who are poor and uneducated lack the wisdom or knowledge to manage or interact sustainably with the environments around them. An assumption that, as Foke's indispensability to Pia's fieldwork suggests, is incorrect. The Glory of Bonbibi, a legend about a goddess and her brother who save a poor sailor from the salivating jaws of a demon in the form of a tiger, is threaded through the novel, serving as an etiological myth for the relations between humans and tigers in Tide country. In the legend, Duki, the sailor, has been sold to a demon in a Faustian bargain made by his boss, one that sells Duki's poor life in exchange for inestimable riches. As the demon Dokinrai readies to pounce and devour him, Duki calls on Bonbibi, the protector of the disenfranchised, to save him. She in turn summons her brother, Shah Jonguli, who deals the demon a resounding blow. To protect Doki and others like him going forward, Bonbibi and her brother draw an invisible line that divides Tide country, marking the regions where people have Bonbibi's protection and those where protection from the demon is not assured. In the context of the battles between the settlers at Morris Japi and the Forest Department, as well as the conflict between Pia and the tiger-killing mob, the allegorical purchase of the glory of Bonbibi is rather on the nose. Duki is sold to the tiger by the powerful, just as the protection of the tiger without consideration of the inhabitants of the Sundarbans, all but declares an open season on them as tiger food. To protect Duki from the tiger and the tiger demon from further altercations, Bonbibi divides the islands into two zones, one for the protection of the tiger and the forest, the other for the settlement of humans. Bonbibi's governance, unlike that of the Indian government and its forestry department, takes both the tiger and the poor into account, even as it quite literally demonizes the tiger by way of explaining its penchant for human flesh and distress. The token of her presence and her protection, her messengers, are the Irrawaddy dolphins that Pia has traveled all this way to study. A species whose history points towards a long pattern of colonial misapprehension and mislabeling. Bonbibi's legend is also a connecting thread between generations of characters. Folklore is taught that the dolphins are Bonbibi's messengers, and the most comprehensive articulation of the myth we receive comes through his singing. Kanai, who translates Folklore's song so Pia can understand it, came to the myth watching a traveling theatre of production with Folklore's mother, Kusum, when they were children. And Kusum, who is steeped in this legend, experiences it as a traumatic reminder of her own father's death. As a young child, she watches him killed by a tiger and remains despondent that Bonbibi did not protect him. This legend, then, casts the settlement of the Tide country as a struggle between humans and tigers that is resolved only by divine intervention and arbitration. Bonbibi's division of the Tide country functions as a form of land management, one that acts as a check on both tiger predations and heedless human expansion. This is a check that is decidedly effective for the inhabitants of the Tide country, who tend to be poor and all but invisible to the intellectuals and the elites who make environmental policy. To enforce this invisible line, Dokinrai and his demons stir up freak storms whenever humans venture into their territory. This is an interpretation of the unpredictable storms that Horan offers when Nirmal recounts the story of a 17th century Jesuit priest's travels in the region. Although Nirmal's impulse is to discount Horan's interpretation as mere superstition, the fisherman's reading provides some insight into the mythological geography of the Sundarbans. Quote, "They must have crossed the line. That's what happened then. They crossed the line by mistake and ended up on one of Dokinrai's islands. Whenever you have a storm like that, one that appears suddenly out of nowhere, you know it's the doing of Dokinrai and his demons." End quote. Horan's response suggests that the impulse of those who inhabit the Tide country, one that might extend to the settlers at Morris Japi, is not towards limitless expansion. If there exists an invisible line that divides the inhabitable from the uninhabitable lands, with grave metaphysical and meteorological consequences, then it stands to reason that the impulse towards unchecked expansion that underwrites the conservation efforts of the colonial government isn't shared by the inhabitants of the Tide country, many of whom, like Kusum, Horan, and Fokir, are fervent believers in Bonbibi and this invisible line. There is a real urgency to Kanai and Pia's critical re-examination of where and upon whom the costs of conservation and wildlife protection fall. One that brings Fokir into this theoretical triangle by drawing on his symbiosis with the environment around him. Witnessing the tiger killing yields the uncomfortable realization on Pia's part that she and Fokir, in spite of their undeniable connection, are communicating across a seemingly unbridgeable gulf of cultural and experiential knowledge. A gulf poignantly bridged when Fokir dies protecting Pia in a terrain-altering storm. After his death, Pia leaves Lucy Barrett to spend time with her Calcutta-based family and process everything that has happened on her travels. To Nilima's surprise, she returns with a commitment to Fokir's widow and son, and with plans for a conservation project that gestures towards bridging the cultural and methodological gap between her, the Western-trained scientist, and fishermen like Fokir. Quote, "I wrote up a report on my dolphin sightings in this area. It was very impressionistic, of course, since I'd lost all my data, but it sparked a lot of interest. I've had several offers of funding from conservation and environmental groups, but I didn't want to go ahead without talking to you first. You know a lot about the people who live here, and for myself, I don't want to do the kind of work that places the burden of conservation on those who can least afford it. If I was to take on a project here, I'd want it to be under the sponsorship of the Badabun Trust, so the local fishermen would be involved. Prior to this, it is on the question of ecological views that Pia and Fokio's differences seem irreconcilable. And although it is tempting to read Pia as the avatar of North American deep ecological views, and Fokio as the representative of what Ramachandra Guha and Juan Martinez Alié have dubbed the environmentalism of the poor, Ghosh's character sketches are not quite that simple. Pia eventually finds the balance between these two perspectives in a place-based organization that not only takes the views and concerns of the demographics so often discounted into account, but gives them a place in the decision-making process. In this way, Pia steps out of a top-down conservational model that hands down decisions to those who must bear yet can ill afford their costs, and begins the work of moving toward a more collaborative model that would hopefully minimize the disenfranchisement that has often accompanied Western conservational practice. She arrives at a hybrid conservational theory and praxis rooted in the Sundarbans, one that might be representative of a hybrid conservational theory and practice rooted in the Global South more generally. Thank you.